Welcome to Inspire Change, a new inspirational and motivational broadcast that strives to empower men in a positive way, designed to educate, empower, and inspire even the busiest individual on the go over that first cup of coffee. Please join me in welcoming Gunter, international psychologist, author, speaker, and producer.
Welcome everybody to another podcast on Inspire Change with me, Gunter. So, from the last episode, I want to pick up on the theme that really leadership is intertwined with my own growth. So essentially, a better I leads to a better we. And in that better we can build a stronger, healthier, and more appropriate way of relating to each other in our culture, which is by definition as diverse as it can be. Now, some time ago, I gave a presentation at a conference on domestic violence, and there I met an impressive man, a Maori from New Zealand, Dean Clarkson, and he spoke about working in a program that helped Polynesian men really take stock of the whole issue about violence, especially domestic violence in the culture. And the way that he did it was very, very interesting. He asked the audience who had seen Once Were Warriors, which was, if you haven't seen it, a highly impressive, but also in some respects very, very disturbing movie. And it took a very in-depth look at the current Maori culture, at least at the time. And this is now going, I think, back into the 80s. Now, to his surprise, in some respects, a lot of people in the audience had seen the film. And his observation about that was that if that was the impression that people had of Maori culture, it was really quite sad, because that was what was happening perhaps in modern day, but in traditional Maori culture, before the colonization, men were taught to be warriors, but they were also taught that that is a behavior that has a place in the culture and in its relationship to others, but it isn't who they necessarily are. What they are in their essence is also the protector, which is much, much more important, and the nurturer. And he spoke about how Maori men would take the children and strap them to themselves and go through the day. Now, interestingly enough, in me that evoked a documentary that I saw on chimpanzees, and then another one on gorillas, where the leader of the group had adopted an orphaned baby and would care for that baby as if it was his or her own. And to me, that's a fascinating story. It highlights that at the heart of it, men are not aggressive. That in essence, we have the same caring and nurturing qualities and dispositions that supposedly women have. Years and years ago, I discovered some research which actually fundamentally shifted a lot of my thinking. And that research demonstrated that the whole notion of the maternal instinct was in fact a myth. It was about socialization. So the idea that somehow men are the aggressor and that we need to be taught and socialized to control that aggression in order to be the protector or the carer or the nurturer now seems to be a complete and utter nonsense. And it goes along with the research that shows or that demonstrates clearly that excessive testosterone does not necessarily make men aggressive. And that in fact that whole approach to understanding what testosterone does within male physiology and neurobiology and psychobiology needs to be a lot more clearly defined. That our idea is that high testosterone makes you more aggressive and potentially more violent is in fact not true. So I want to focus on fundamentally what are the social consequences of allowing men to become more of what we've seen in those experiments, where they are more the carer, the nurturer, and the protector in a sense. And a lot of times that protector is in conjunction with women. It's not done in isolation. We protect each other. We have each other's back. So I want to take a look at some of those relationships. And the first one, and I'm going to come back to my fundamental framework uh, in making good men great, and that is that competition is not the main driver in human relationships, especially not in male relationships. That competition is a secondary factor to a whole process of socialization according to patriarchal ideology. In fact, when you think about it really, really simply, if we wind the clock back to when we were little hominids in the savannah wasteland, the only way that we had an edge on survival was through cooperation. A small 4-foot hominid really does not stand a chance in the wild. But 10 or 15 with some tools will have an edge. They will be more successful. They'll survive better. And in fact, it's that cooperation that's led us throughout our history to become better and better at many, many different things. But we keep getting refocused, certainly as men, into this whole competitive arena. So if I take this whole process another step further, my social relationships are going to be better. They're going to be more fruitful if I look at cooperative relationships. Now, as you might have picked up, part of the framework is also in leadership that I need to have a good vision. So my vision now includes the capacity of cooperation. How can I cooperate with those that I'm in a relationship with better? So what does that result in? Well, one of the most important aspects or consequences of cooperation is that cooperation leads to trust. And I think that's a really underrated idea in our culture. And certainly in leadership development and in organizational development, and just in terms of community development, that level of cooperation isn't necessarily frequently linked to the idea that that helps us to trust each other. And one of the ways that I often explain it in parenting is that if your teenager cooperates with you, you're more likely to trust that teenager with something like the keys to the car. If he doesn't cooperate, well, then my suggestion is don't trust him to do the right thing with the car, because he generally won't. So the idea here is that cooperation leads to trust. And trust, ultimately, in our personal relationships, in our social relationships, in our global relationships, is fundamentally important. And one of the things that we're seeing right here and now in our societies globally is that trust has become significantly challenged and is, in fact, in my view, declining. And part of that is because a lot of our ideas about what makes a successful society is based on competition, and that competition is based on my individual prowess or merit or success. And in Zimbardo's terms, we're talking about our culture being I-centric. But that's not useful. We need to think about being sociocentric. In other words, we need to think about ourselves within the context of our society, our communities, our intimate relationship. Now, having done a lot of work with couples and being, very enamored with the Gottmans and the research and the work that they've done in dealing with the dynamics of couples, one of the things that the Gottmans talk about is that there are 5 criteria for trust. The first one is honesty. And that is, you cannot trust someone who lies to you. Now, think about that in the big picture, but also think about it in the little picture. Honesty is a fundamental cornerstone in our capacity to both cooperate and then develop trust. Simply speaking, don't allow yourself to find excuses and rationalize why they've lied. Just accept that that's what they've done. Now, the second criteria that Gottmans talk about is that of transparency. And this is defined by the level of openness. Is the person that you're dealing with, is the community that you're dealing with an open book? And are they willing to engage with putting the cards on the table? So transparency in an intimate relationship is about being transparent about what you're thinking, what you're feeling, and what that may consequently lead to. It includes both negative and positive emotions. It includes both negative and positive thoughts. But in sharing that, we're not just making ourselves transparent, we're actually also allowing ourselves to be vulnerable enough for that other person to experience this in a non-defensive way. The third criteria that the Gottmans talk about is accountability. And that is, does the person you're dealing with keep their promises, follow through with their commitments? And again, you can follow this through every layer of our relationships, whether that be personal, friendships, intimate relationships, work relationships, community relationships. Do people accept responsibility for their part in a problem? Or do they have a tendency to blame others, to shirk owning their part in the whole process? As I said, one of the cornerstones in team development, and this comes from Patrick Lencioni, is that a criteria for an effective team is trust and accountability. It's also about dealing with conflict constructively, but I'll get to that in a later episode, in a later podcast. Now, the Gottmans talk about the fourth criteria as being ethical actions. And this is where it gets seriously in depth. The question arises about, what do you do when you detect immoral actions, or if you are uncomfortable with someone's morals? And in intimate relationships, my view is that without the first four being clearly defined within the relationship, the best step that you can take is to move on. Now, how do you do that within a social setting? Well, again, it's about having appropriate boundaries. All of us, to some degree or another, have an idea about what's ethical and moral. There are, however, people in our society who don't care about those, or who do not, in the most extreme sense, have any other benchmark for ethics and morality other than what's in their own best interest. And that is deeply, deeply disturbing. And unfortunately, in our current cultural setting, in our geopolitical environment, this has become now the norm, especially amongst politicians. And again, one of the things that I'm trying to highlight persistently in these podcasts is that individual change will lead to social change, and it needs to. Anyone familiar with history will recognize that we're in a period of time that is very, very similar to the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. And if you're interested in that, there's a great book called The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire. Read it, because we need to learn from history. We have just kept perpetuating the same problem again and again and again. And Roman society was fundamentally a patriarchal society. It was not based on egalitarian principles. So what's the fifth criteria that the Gottmans talk about? They talk about a proof of alliance. In other words, can the person that you're in a relationship with demonstrate that they've got your back? Even in the very smallest ways, then that can allow you to start trusting them. Do they have your best interest at heart? Instead of just simply acting out of a deep-seated self-interest. Now, you've got to be careful with this, because some people will argue that all of our actions are motivated by self-interest. Now, that's an extremely shallow critique. In fact, our actions, generally speaking, need a few criteria. And in an alliance, it's about sustainability and longevity. My alliance with someone is not transactional. It's based on all the criteria that builds an environment of trust. And I will maintain that, because these things are not simply there for my need. They're there for both my need and that of the community. Otherwise, society begins to disintegrate, and it starts off with a split between I and them, from which we can often dehumanize. In other words, the us is okay, the them becomes the enemy, and they somehow need to be dominated, controlled, and kept in their place. And we've got lots of examples, both in the small sphere of our society, but also on the geopolitical level. So when I talk about change and inspiring change, I want to inspire you as an individual to be accountable for these things, to, how cooperative are you in your relationships? How trustworthy are you in your relationships? How honest, how transparent, how accountable, how ethical are you? And when someone is in a relationship with you, how do you keep their back? How do you back them up? How do you support them? And how do you not enable their bad behavior? So again, in that context, it's not the warrior that we need to be. It's the carer, nurturer, and protector of all these principles and our relationships. That's fundamentally at the heart of it. So again, I'm leaving you with a bit of a challenge. I hope this was useful. I hope to see that you can take this up as a practical thing, and it's not just an intellectual or emotional exercise. Yes, it's all very well for us as men to be good at being in touch with our feelings and articulating them, but there is so much more to being a great man than simply being open with emotions. And that's the challenge in our environment, in our culture today. Till next time, I'm signing off. Please reflect. Please think about what changes you can make in your life. And I'll speak to you soon.
Thank you, Gunter, and thank you to our listeners. Inspired Change with Gunter Swoboda. Please join us every Wednesday for a new broadcast by visiting www.spreaker.com/show/inspire-change, which will feature all the ways you can listen. If you have comments or suggestions, email producer@studio3hollywood.net. Thank you and have an inspiring day.